Jessica, thanks. We've got to break in here because we do have breaking news now, just into CNN. A federal judge has sided with CNN, saying the White House was wrong to revoke our colleague Jim Acosta's press pass. Federal Judge Timothy Kelly ordering the White House to reinstate his press pass, this initial victory, to reinstate because they had sought immediate relief, emergency relief to this. So a victory. In this case, you could say broader, more than for CNN, for press freedom.
Again, this is about all press access to the White House, whether the administration or any administration likes questions asked or the tone they're asked in or not. This is about the First Amendment and the Fifth Amendment. Our experts are with us, Chief Media Correspondent Brian Stelter and our Chief Legal Analyst Jeffrey Toobin. Jeffrey, to you on the law. This seems to be, from what we're seeing initially, even more of a Fifth Amendment due process win here.
Right, and it doesn't necessarily mean Jim Acosta and CNN's ordeal is over, but there should be no ambiguity. CNN and Jim Acosta won in court today. But what the judge said was, if you are going to take away a hard pass, there has to be some sort of explanation, some sort of process, some sort of standards for doing that if you're going to if you are going to threaten First Amendment rights in this way.
Right.
So basically what the judge has done has thrown this issue back to the White House and said, okay, there may be a justification for you to take away Jim Acosta's press pass, but you have to create and establish and follow some rules to do that, and let him understand what he's accused of violating and let him defend himself. But in the meantime, he gets his press pass back, and the status quo returns.
So wait, until this point, to revoke a hard pass, as it's called, you would need to be a threat to the president. Is that right? Based on a Secret Service judgment.
Right.
I mean, is the judge inviting the White House to create new rules here to do
I
this?
think the judge is inviting, is not inviting, he's requiring the White House both to clarify what the rules are that justify taking away a hard pass, as these passes are known, plus giving the hard pass owner, Jim Acosta or the next person charged, some opportunity to say, that's not fair, it's not right. Create some sort of process for, rather than just taking it away willy-nilly.
And Brian, the argument that CNN's attorneys made here is that this was capricious and arbitrary, doing this against Jim Acosta and against CNN, and this is the judge agreeing with that in part.
Yes, and at times this judge, a Trump appointee, seemed to emphasize the limited nature of his ruling. It seems he does not want to say completely that this is a CNN, that CNN is in the clear here. This is going to be a legal battle, as Jeffrey is saying. Our colleagues in the courtroom are sharing some quotes from the judge that I'll share here. Marshall Cohen, Jessica Schneider, David Shortell at the courthouse. They said the judge says, I want to emphasize the very limited nature of today's ruling. I have not determined that the First Amendment was violated here. I have not determined specific nature of First Amendment interest in this case, but the headline here is that the temporary restraining order has been granted. That means Acosta's press pass is returned right away and will at least be in his hands for a short period of time while these underlying legal arguments are determined.
So Jeffrey, you then go to the bigger case. Emergency relief was granted. He has it now, but there will still be a court proceeding here. Both sides will make arguments. The same judge will then make a larger decision down the road?
Not yet. Not
on
yet.
Permanent relief.
But I mean, I guess the ball is really now in the White House's court. They have to decide. Now, in a sane world, I think, what would happen is Jim Acosta would have a meeting with the White House communications director, and the director would say, let's knock it off. Let's lower the temperature here. Let's behave like adults, and then the whole thing would be dropped.
That's a sane world.
That's a sane world.
Let's dismiss the sane world.
Right? Yeah. That's how this would operate in a rational world.
Here's a question I have to both of you on that front. Even if that's the case, and even if that solves the issue between Jim Acosta, and CNN and the White House on this front, this is again a bigger case, Jeffrey. This is a case about whether any White House or any administration has the right, the Fifth and First Amendment right to do this. So shouldn't it be a case that ultimately is decided big picture?
Well, not necessarily, because the next step, as I understand the preliminary ruling, is that the White House has to either drop the whole thing and patch things up, or establish clearer rules about what justifies the removal of a hard pass and how the accused hard pass abusers are allowed to defend themselves.
Right,
That
he's focused on the Fifth Amendment. He's saying it's all about due process.
Yes.
He's not ruling on the First Amendment right now. It's almost as if this judge begrudgingly is giving this press pass back, but knows he has to follow the law, follow the precedent that goes back to the 1970s, the Sherrill case, which says if you're going to deny someone a press pass, you've got to have a really specific reason, and in practice that means a threat to the president's
And if
life.
I can just add one point, I mean, you know, all of us, including me, are often cynical about judges, and, you know, we say he's a Trump appointee, and as if that's the answer to all the questions. This strikes me as an extremely savvy and wise resolution of this case. I mean, this is a way of sort of preserving Jim Acosta's right to do his job and CNN's right to cover the news, which is, of course, paramount in our view, but also telling the White House, you know, you have a right to maintain decorum and discipline. You just have to do it in an orderly and fair
follow
way.
due
Yeah,
process.
So
so I
sometimes
think
it's
this-
about competence versus incompetence. And oftentimes in the White House, we see incompetence leads to problems and legal decisions against the White House. So we'll see if they come up with a new way.
I'm not going to ask either of you to predict, but I'm going to ask both of you to predict.
Yeah.
Based on the, I mean, you saw this with the AT&T merger, right?
Yeah.
A decision that seemed, you know, the opposition to it seemed to be far-fetched, and yet the White House pursued, and I believe appealed. I mean, based on precedent, do you see the White House continuing with this case in effect?
Well, look
Let
at what
him
Mercedes
answer.
Schlapp
I don't
said
know.
yesterday. Mercedes is one of the communications officials at the White House. She said, we are not going to tolerate bad behavior. She said that in the present tense.
Right.
We're not going to tolerate it at the White House. She also wouldn't rule out revoking press credentials from other reporters.
Right.
This all comes from the top. Let's be clear.
Yeah, right.
The President of the United States does not want to be questioned. He does not want to be challenged. He does not want to acknowledge what real news is. And so he's lashing out. He lashed out 9 days ago, and Acosta was the victim.
You left out
now
one,
Acosta's
you left out
press
one
pass
thing.
is back.
He also hates CNN.
Okay,
And,
fair.
and the fact that,
But
you know, he's targeted
there-
CNN is relevant.
There is a beauty to co-equal branches of government, right? And checks and balances. Don't go anywhere, guys. Jessica Schneider, not only our correspondent inside the courtroom, but also an attorney, is with us. Jess, what stood out to you?
Well, you know, Poppy, this was very interesting. This judge, extremely succinct and straightforward with this ruling, and noting that he wasn't going very broadly with this ruling, but he was in fact granting a victory to CNN and our chief White House correspondent, Jim Acosta, saying that the White House must immediately restore Jim Acosta's hard pass that allows him access to the White House on a daily basis. So this judge taking it very, very narrowly. Remember, this was just this emergency ruling. This was on the temporary restraining order that would restore Jim Acosta's pass for this short period of time while the litigation moves forward. There's the broader issue here. There's whether or not the First Amendment, what rights there are within the White House grounds. You know, the government in that hearing on Wednesday made that very broad argument that really the First Amendment protections do not extend within the White House grounds, and that the president, they said, has broad range to tell which reporters he will take questions from and to let reporters know which ones he will actually admit into the grounds. So the judge saying here, I'm not ruling on those arguments. I am only ruling on the Fifth Amendment due process rights. You know, he noted that the way that this all went down, he laid out the facts right at the top, right before he issued his ruling, saying that the way this all went down, he actually put it this way. He said, this is a highly unusual set of facts. And then he laid out the fact that Jim Acosta showed up at the White House gate on that night, the day after the midterm elections, and that he was actually notified by tweet. He said that just did not satisfy due process. He also pointed to the fact that the government, when they made their arguments on Wednesday, they couldn't point to who the ultimate decision maker was to revoke the hard pass here. They couldn't say whether it was Sarah Sanders, the press secretary, or whether it was the president himself. So he said that hodgepodge set of decision making, whether it was by tweet or by statement or by the president himself, that just did not afford Jim Acosta the due process rights that he needed in order to have that press pass revoked. So a very limited ruling here, but quite a victory for Jim Acosta, for CNN, saying that yes, in fact, Jim Acosta needs to get his hard pass back right away. But again, this judge ruling very narrowly, very limited in his scope here, and now this can go forward as to whether or not there were First Amendment rights violated here. But this judge, again, we've noted, I've heard you guys note, this is a Trump-nominated judge. This judge has only been on the federal bench for just about a year now. So towing the line very carefully here, very narrow in his ruling. But again, a big win for Jim Acosta and CNN, saying that the White House must restore his hard pass immediately. Poppy?
Jessica, I could ask you as well, because it appears that we have the attorneys coming out. We have the attorneys, Jim Acosta and Ted Boutros, attorney for CNN.
We're extremely pleased with the ruling today. This is a great day for the First Amendment and journalism. We're very excited to have Mr. Acosta be able to go back and get his hard pass and report the news about the White House. I'll turn it over to Jim.
Okay. Everybody, thanks for coming. I just want to say something very briefly, and that is I want to thank all of my colleagues in the press who supported us this week. And I want to thank the judge for the decision he made today. And let's go back to work. Thank you.
When do you expect to get...
Simple, short, and sweet from Ted Boutros, attorney for CNN there. It's a great day for the First Amendment and for journalism. And that's a point we've been highlighting throughout the coverage of this story. As we have noted on this air, a number of news organizations across the board, print and television, including Fox News, came out in support of this because they saw this as a precedent that would affect more than just CNN, but other news outlets. I wonder if we could bring back Jessica Schneider just for a moment, as you heard that there, because the judge in his commentary in there did take down some of the government's, the White House's arguments, said that it was of questionable accuracy that Jim Acosta, for instance, placed his hands on the intern, but also said very, very explicitly that it would have caused irreparable harm to Acosta and CNN to keep the pass, that pass revoked. So some fairly strong words from the judge, even in what was a limited ruling.
Right, exactly. And the judge here really had to follow the case law in the D.C. Circuit. And one of the overriding cases was from a journalist that was excluded from the White House back in the 1960s and 1970s. So the judge had to strictly adhere to that ruling. And the judge made the point that while the White House has said that CNN has 50 other employees which are hard pass eligible, that have those hard passes, it didn't matter. That in this case, this was about an individual journalist. This is about an individual journalist's rights, in this case, the due process rights, and whether or not those were violated, in which case the judge here said that there was the likelihood of success that they would prove that those due process rights were violated. But it didn't matter that CNN has a whole cadre of journalists, photojournalists, reporters, producers. What mattered was Jim Acosta as an individual journalist and the fact that his due process rights were likely violated here, that he didn't get the opportunity to be heard, or there wasn't any clear notification, and it was unclear who exactly made this decision. The reasoning from the government, from the White House, was jumbled. The judge did reference that as well. He said that initially Sarah Sanders mentioned that Jim Acosta had placed his hand on that intern who tried to take the microphone away, but then the judge also noted that in later statements that reasoning wasn't mentioned, and the White House simply referred to disrespectful conduct on the part of Mr. Acosta. So he said that was problematic as well. But yes, the judge definitely ruling that it is the individual journalist's rights that should not be interfered with in this case. It doesn't matter about the organization as a whole and whether or not they have other journalists to supplant Jim Acosta in this case. It matters for the individual right of a journalist and their press freedom and their due process rights. Guys?
Yeah. Well, the law matters. We've seen it here. We saw it with the Muslim ban. We saw it with family separation at the border. The judges step up for the law.
Jessica Schneider, great reporting. Thank you. Let's bring back in Jeffrey Toobin and Brian Selter. You know, Jeffrey, I've always been proud to call Jim Acosta a colleague and a friend. But just those words, all he said was, let's get back to work. This is not about him. This is about press freedom, and he will go back to work today.
And look, the criticism of Acosta is always that he's too aggressive, he's a showboat. That's what you hear on Fox News, that he grandstands. But you saw the real Jim Acosta just now. very simply saying he wants to get back to work. Look, there's a lot to cover at this White House. There's a lot to cover in the Trump presidency. We need to have reporters on the front lawn covering these stories every day, including Jim Acosta. So it's an important moment for press freedom in the U.S. because this entire case is a test of the rights that we have in America for coverage of the White House, for coverage of politicians, and even reporters in other states, you know, who cover state houses, who cover city councils. Yeah. They're watching this too, because a tone, again, always gets set from the top. The president's attacks on the press are endless, but today the institutions worked. The courts ruled in the favor of the free press, and of course, as Jessica was saying, limited ruling. We will see what happens down the line, but it was an important first round.
And what was so striking about this was the unanimity of the press corps. Everyone from the New York Times to Fox News itself saying, this is not right.
Because
what happened
they know
to Jim
it
Acosta.
could be them.
Well, that's right. And you know, one way of looking at what Jim Acosta was accused of doing was being too aggressive with follow-up questions. Another word for that is journalism.
There you go.
And that goes, and if that results in losing your ability to do your livelihood, throwing you out of the press corps, that's a threat to everyone who covers. I mean, as Brian said, not just the White House, but state houses and city halls.
Think of the precedent. I said this on the air the other day.
Right.
The only other personal experience I've had of this is in China, where China rejected and overturned and took away press credentials because they didn't like the questions asked or the coverage of the stories. I'm not saying the U.S. is China. I'm just saying that there's a commonality there, right?
You don't want to get even close to that.
There's a lot to protect about the American experiment. This is part of it. And CNN just issued a statement, both CNN and Acosta. I'll read it to you. It says, "We are gratified with this ruling, this result, and we look forward to a full resolution in the coming days. Our sincere thanks to all who have supported not just CNN, but a free, strong, and independent press."
But I do think it is worth pointing out that this process is not over. The White House has a choice to make now.
To proceed.
That they can, it seems to me, call Jim Acosta in and say, look, we really thought what you did was wrong. We hope you knock it off, but let's shake hands and move on. That, to me, is the smart resolution. Alternatively, the judge did give them an invitation to say, we are going to establish procedures. We are going to continue to try to take away your hard pass. We are going to continue this battle. Right. The White House now has to choose which of those courses to go.
Yeah, and we know the president loves to fight. He loves to pick these fights,
and, you know,
but he lost today.
And he's already been fundraising off of this fight with CNN.
He could make a political judgment that continuing this in the courts, even if it's a loser, eventually is in his political interest. And he's made decisions like that before.
We shall see.
Thank you.
Jeffrey, Brian, thanks very much for covering this throughout. Quite a fascinating story for us to cover as
certainly.
well. We got a lot more news. We'll be right back.